Cyberpunk 2077 was supposed to be something extraordinary. A massive open-world RPG where your choices could change the story. Night City would react to your actions, and countless systems would work together to make you feel like you were actually living in the future. The hype became enormous, especially after the incredible trailers and gameplay demonstrations. Players expected a revolutionary RPG with deep customization, meaningful choices, advanced AI, and a living city unlike anything they had seen before. But when Cyberpunk 2077 finally launched, players discovered something very different. Some promises had been changed. Some features were heavily reduced, and others simply never made it into the final game. The launch problems made the situation even worse, especially on older consoles. So today, we're going to look at the biggest promises, missing features, and controversial changes surrounding Cyberpunk 2077 and find out just how different the final game was from what players were originally promised. One of the biggest selling points of Cyberpunk 2077 was player choice. CD Projekt Red repeatedly talked about a world where your decisions would have meaningful consequences, creating different paths through the story and changing how Night City responded to you. And to be fair, Cyberpunk does have choices. Some missions can play out differently. Certain characters can survive or die, and the game features multiple endings depending on your decisions. But the problem was the scale of what players expected. The marketing created the impression that Night City would be a deeply reactive world where almost everything you did could shape the future. In reality, many choices only affect individual conversations, specific missions, or smaller parts of the story, while the main narrative often returns to a similar path. So the choice system wasn't completely fake, but compared with what players were led to expect, the consequences were much more limited. The idea was ambitious, but the final game didn't fully deliver the incredibly reactive world many people imagined. Then there was Night City itself. CD Projekt Red presented it as more than just a beautiful map. It was supposed to feel like a living city, filled with people who had their own routines, reactions, and lives. And visually, Night City is still incredible. The architecture, neon lights, crowds, and atmosphere make it one of the most impressive cities in gaming. But there was a big difference between how alive the city looked and how deeply it actually simulated the world. NPCs generally didn't have complex daily routines like some players expected. Many pedestrians simply followed predetermined paths, and the police system at launch was especially basic. Instead of a city that truly understood everything happening around you, Night City often felt more like a massive movie set. Beautiful? Absolutely. Truly simulated? Not quite. The police system made the problem even more obvious. In a game about crime, gangs, and a dangerous futuristic city, you'd expect law enforcement to be a major part of the experience. But at launch, the police system was surprisingly basic. If you committed a crime, officers could sometimes appear almost directly behind you, seemingly out of nowhere. There were no proper vehicle pursuits, no sophisticated investigation system, and very little sense that the police were actually tracking you through Night City. You could steal a car, cause chaos, drive around a corner, and suddenly find police officers waiting for you. For a game advertised as an incredibly immersive RPG, the police system felt surprisingly unfinished. Then there's the Life Path system. Before release, choosing between Nomad, Street Kid, and Corpo sounded like it would fundamentally change who V was and how their story would unfold. Each background seemed like it could lead to a completely different experience in Night City. But after the opening, the three paths quickly merge into the same main storyline. You do get a unique introduction, special dialogue options, and occasional decisions based on your background, but the differences aren't nearly as dramatic as many players expected. Your character isn't really three completely different versions of V. You're essentially playing the same main story with a different beginning, and some additional dialogue throughout the game. For a title marketed as a deep role-playing experience where your character's background would matter, the Life Path system felt like another missed opportunity. The idea was interesting, but its influence on the overall game was much smaller than the marketing suggested. Night City also created another problem: expectations. The city looked so detailed and enormous that players naturally assumed there would be countless things to actually do inside it. But outside of missions, side quests, shops, and collectibles, there wasn't as much interactive content as many people expected. You couldn't really become part of a neighborhood, meaningfully interact with most buildings, or create a completely different lifestyle for V. Many locations that looked like they should be interactive were simply there for decoration. Cyberpunk gave players an enormous playground filled with incredible sights and detailed environments. The problem was that much of that playground was designed to be looked at rather than truly played with. And then there were the bugs. Cyberpunk 2077 became famous for them almost immediately after release. NPCs would randomly disappear, cars could fly through the air, characters could get stuck in strange positions, and physics could completely break. Textures could disappear, objects could float, and sometimes the entire game would simply crash. Some of these glitches were hilarious and quickly became viral clips across the internet, but others were much more serious. Players weren't just finding funny bugs, they were losing progress, getting stuck during quests, experiencing repeated crashes, and dealing with extremely poor performance, especially on older consoles. And when a game had been marketed for years as the next generation of open-world RPGs, these technical problems made the gap between expectations and reality impossible to ignore. But the biggest problem wasn't simply the PC version. On PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, Cyberpunk 2077 could perform extremely poorly, especially considering how long players had been waiting for the game. Players reported frequent crashes, extremely low performance, missing textures, visual glitches, disappearing objects, and other serious technical problems. Some areas of Night City could become almost impossible to play smoothly, making the experience frustrating from the very beginning. The situation became so serious that Sony temporarily removed Cyberpunk 2077 from the PlayStation Store and offered refunds to customers. Microsoft also introduced its own refund policy for affected players. And this is where the controversy became much bigger than disappointed fans complaining about missing features. For many people, the game they purchased was genuinely difficult to play. The promise was a massive next-generation RPG. The reality, especially on older consoles, was a game that simply wasn't ready for release. But this is where the story gets interesting. Cyberpunk 2077 didn't stay the way it was at launch. CD Projekt Red spent years fixing, updating, and rebuilding major parts of the game based on player feedback. The police system was redesigned, the skill tree was completely overhauled, and systems involving cyberware, combat, driving, and progression were significantly improved. The game also received numerous technical fixes that made Night City much more stable and enjoyable to explore. Then came Phantom Liberty, which showed just how much potential Cyberpunk 2077 still had. The expansion introduced a new area, new missions, characters, gameplay systems, and major improvements to the overall experience. The difference between launch Cyberpunk and the modern version is enormous. Today, the game is genuinely much better. But there's an important point. Fixing a game years after release doesn't change what players received on day one. And that's why Cyberpunk 2077 remains such a fascinating example of a game that eventually became much closer to what people originally wanted. So, was Cyberpunk 2077 a lie? Not completely. There was a genuinely great game underneath all those problems, and the developers clearly had an ambitious vision for what Cyberpunk could become. But the Cyberpunk 2077 we were promised was much more ambitious than what players actually received when the game launched in 2020. The marketing created expectations of a living city, incredibly deep player choices, advanced AI, and a truly immersive next-generation RPG. The final launch version simply couldn't deliver all of that. Today, the game is in a completely different place, and it's honestly impressive how much CD Projekt Red managed to improve. Major systems were rebuilt, performance became much better, and Phantom Liberty showed what the game could really become. But if we're talking about the original launch, the city was as alive as promised, the choices weren't as deep as expected, and the game simply wasn't ready. Cyberpunk 2077 eventually became a great game. It just took years to become the game many players thought they were buying. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.